Hey, welcome back to the Faithful Considerations Podcast. I'm your host, J.B. Shreve, and we are in part 4 of our podcast series looking at the days of David, looking at everything from Samuel to Saul, and today we're going to take a deep dive on the Philistines, these arch nemesis of the Old Testament, of the Israelites during the Old Testament period. So we're going to look at see who they were. We're also going to explore the fall of Saul. Last episode we looked at the rise of King Saul. Now we're going to look at the fall of King Saul, which gives rise to the rise of David, evidently. And so inevitably, that's coming in the next episode. We'll look at the anointing of David when that hit. But that's all still to come. Today, we're looking at the Philistines. And so hope you're enjoying this podcast series. Probably won't do any ads or anything like that during this one today because we have a lot of ground to cover. If you are enjoying it, I hope you'll share this with your friends on social media, where tell people about it, let people get the word out, help us get the word out about what we're doing here. And I think that's going to be it. Let's go ahead and jump in to today's podcast episode on the Days of David podcast series. So if you've done even a little bit of reading through the Bible, you know that the Bible, especially the Old Testament, has its share of infamous bad guys. As far as the nations are concerned, the Egyptians, maybe the Babylonians, are the most recognizable. You know, the Babylonians, they were the first major global empires in the age of empires. And of course, that empire is famous or infamous for taking the Israelites into captivity. A large part of the Old Testament covers that story. But a close runner-up to the Babylonians, to the Egyptians, well, that would have to be the Philistines, or the Philistines, as we say sometimes in the South. Goliath was a Philistine. From the book of Judges and into the stories of David, it's the Philistines who plague Israel with the greatest fear. In later centuries, the plague of the Philistines on this land was so well remembered that the Romans actually named the land Palestine. And that's a derivative of that means the land of the Philistines. That's what the Romans called it. This was long after the might of the Philistines had actually been defeated. In fact, it was David who defeated the Philistines. He's the one who broke their back, broke their power in the land. They still existed after him to some extent, but the peak of their strength really came about during the time of Saul. And it was David who annihilated them annihilated the Philistines as a united people. The Philistines are somewhat of a historical mystery. We don't know a whole lot about them, like we do the Hittites or the Moabites or other land-based tribes and people that the Israelites encountered in the Old Testament. And I say land-based because the Philistines were a sea-based people. They were a sea people. And it's believed they came from the Aegean Sea. All right, so that's the sea between modern-day nations of Greece and Turkey. And it was this sea that early civilizations from Europe and Asia, that's where they first made contact at. So for those interested in ancient history, you've got the Minoans, you've got the Mycenaeans that came from here. And if you're into the movies like 300, The Rise of an Empire, movies about Sparta and Athens and Persia, a lot of that, the real history for those events took place in the Aegean Sea, all right? So the Philistines and the time period we're looking at, they go back further in history than that, though, than those famous movies. Because of our Sunday school pictures of Goliath and the Philistines, I think most of us have images of Philistines that's probably off as far as what they looked like. Most of mine were off anyways. A more accurate perspective would be to imagine them like Vikings. They were sea peoples. They would raid coastal cities, move up rivers and conquer and loot, and all these ancient civilizations, they came in contact with the Philistines and their atrocities, their marauding, right? They would raid coastal cities, move up rivers, conquer and loot a lot of the ancient civilizations. There's recorded histories of the Philistines invading Egypt and the Pharaoh, Ramses III. He fought them back from the Nile and the Mediterranean. That's actually recorded history there. As they went from one land to another aboard their ships, these invaders, these Philistine invaders, they caused all sorts of havoc, all sorts of upheaval. And so this all happened in the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age. Now that's another important part of the background for understanding what's going on in the book of 1 Samuel as we read about the beginning of the Israelite monarchy, the rise of Saul, and then of course of David. Throughout history, technological shifts meant huge transitions on the ground for the people living at that time. The last 300 years has seen enormous advances in human civilization brought on by technological shifts like the Industrial Revolution, the discoveries in physics, communications, lots of things like that. We've shifted more in the last 200 years within human civilization than we actually did in the prior 10,000 years combined. That's how rapid. We've gotten accustomed to this moving real fast, and it's not really normal to the rest of human history for how fast we've been moving these last 2 centuries. Well, the easiest place to measure those shifts in technology, of course, that's in the realm of weapons. Human civilizations who are the first to adapt technology to their military usually end up on the front end of the benefits of the new age that technology ushers in. So in the Bronze Age, the civilizations around Mesopotamia, that's where Abraham came from, they were among the first to learn to adapt bronze into weaponry, into tools. That took place around 3300 BC. Ended the Stone Age when people used stones for the same purposes. Well, bronze was more effective, more efficient as a farming instrument, as a killing instrument. And that's why large-scale societies began to spring up, began to form during this time period. At the tip of the spear, literally and metaphorically, was usually bronze weaponry, bronze technology, bronze tools. A couple of thousand years later, the Bronze Age collapses with the arrival of the Iron Age. So you probably guess what happens here. A lot of those same Bronze Age civilizations figure out how to graduate from bronze to steel, and they shifted their weapons and tools over to iron, specifically by steel. By smelting the metal, they figured out they could make more durable spears, more durable swords and chariots. That meant traveling farther, killing more effectively. It means bigger, faster armies, bigger, deadlier wars. So, why all this talk about Bronze Age and Iron Age in a podcast about David? Because we have to understand that to understand the ferocity, the terrible threat of these sea people known as the Philistines. When we read through the story of 1 and 2 Samuel, we find little tidbits that seem like just extra information. We read about Goliath's sword, his javelin, his spear compared to David's slingshot. We read about Philistine garrisons set up in different parts of the Israelite countryside. These were military outposts manned by the sea peoples, the Philistines, where they kept their weapons stocked, so their military didn't have to carry the heavy steel armor everywhere, but could just run to that garrison, arm up, and fight. Remember when David, before he fights Goliath, we'll get to that in the next episode, but he's decked out in Saul's armor, but he can hardly move. It's too heavy for him. Iron Age weaponry weighing down the little shepherd boy. That's what's really going on here. This is the Iron Age that's dawning here. Check out this verse from 1 Samuel chapter 13. It says, I'm starting in verse 19. It says, "There were no blacksmiths in the land of Israel in those days. The Philistines wouldn't allow them, for fear they would make swords and spears for the Hebrews. So whenever the Israelites needed to sharpen their plowshares, their picks, axes, or sickles, they had to take them down to a Philistine blacksmith. The charges were as follows: 1/4 of an ounce of silver for sharpening a plowshare or a pick, and 1/8 of an ounce for sharpening an axe or making the point of an axe good. So on the day of the battle, none of the people of Israel had a sword or spear except for Saul and Jonathan." Now, if you're just reading through 1 Samuel, you come across that verse, and it seems like just an extra detail, maybe even an unnecessary detail. But it's not. We're seeing that the Philistines were dominating Israel because they monopolized the technology. They didn't want any of the Israelites getting their hands on the same sophisticated weaponry that they had, so there were no blacksmiths, or what we would call armories, in that time available to the Israelites. Saul and Jonathan, his son, they had swords and spear, but that didn't really account for a lot. They needed an army that was armed. The Israelites are stuck under Philistine occupation at the end of the Bronze Age, while the Philistines are at the front end of the Iron Age. That's why they're having so much success up and down the Mediterranean coastline. Philistine power rested on that reality. So, sorry if I'm nerding out on all of this. I just find those little political, those historical realities extra fascinating for understanding the story that's unfolding before us. The Philistines occupied Israel. There were other marauding tribes and armies from the Ammonites to the Hittites and others, but the most consistent threat was the Philistines. All the way back to the book of Joshua, during the era of the conquest of the Promised Land, we learn there were major Philistine cities in the land. That included Gath, that's where Goliath was from, Ashdod, Gaza, Ekron, Ashkelon. These cities will pop up again and again as you read through the books of Judges and 1 Samuel. These were strongholds for the occupying force. You'll remember them from the stories of like Samson, right? And they'll stick out as you read about David in the early years in 1 Samuel, these strongholds of the Philistines. So with that bit of background, we resume our story of the days of David and what's going on. So now we have a king in Israel, young King Saul. That's what we looked at in the last episode. Now his reign isn't short. It lasts over 40 years. And I've mentioned that he had a son named Jonathan. Now Jonathan's a cool character in this story. We're going to come back to him. We'll look at him in greater detail probably in the next couple of episodes. But this is the prince, right? And Jonathan's really everything you would want in a prince, to be honest with you. Where Saul occasionally behaves foolishly, apathetically, kind of off the handle, Jonathan's always steady, focused, vigilant. He's brave, he's bold, he's loyal. His heart is just shaped right? You can see how if you were living in the land at that time, you'd look at Jonathan and think, yeah, this monarchy is in good hands. This kingdom is in good hands. When Saul goes, we'll still have a good successor to lead the realm. Problems have all been solved, right? Throughout Saul's reign as king of Israel, there's a terrible war being waged against the Philistines, all right? Saul's never able to break the back of this army, of this people, this civilization that's moving into Israel. That would be accomplished later on by David, but that doesn't mean that there was anything passive or retreating during the reign of Saul when it came to the Philistines. This constant warfare marked the generation who lived under Saul's rule. During the times of the judges, there would be an occasional reprieve against the sea peoples occupying the lands of the Israelites. But during the reign of Saul, there was a constant push. And that constant push got off to a start almost as soon as he was installed or coronated into the role as king of Israel. And it was Jonathan, the prince, who pushed this out into the open. We read in 1 Samuel chapter 13 that Saul began putting together an army. He surrounded himself with 2,000 troops and then dispatched another 1,000 with Jonathan into the hill country of Benjamin. Then the rest of the country, men of fighting age, remained in a reserve status, ready to be called on at a moment's notice. And by the third verse in, Jonathan makes his move. He and his troops attacked one of the Philistine garrisons in Geba. Everyone knows if you strike and occupy and force one of its outposts, they're going to respond with disproportional force. It's not just a war. After Jonathan attacks this outpost, the Philistines, they want to launch a massive wave of retributions. Their outposts have to be secure. That's the Philistine perspective. Their outpost has to be secure, and the threat of Philistine retribution is what keeps them secure. That threat has always kept the Israelites at bay in the past. Well, now Jonathan's attack comes, and the Philistines, they realize we've got to teach Israel a lesson. So the battle is coming, and a sense of dread, of pending convulsion in Israel fills the land. This would be the test of the new monarchy, the new resistance to the Philistines. So Saul orders the ram's horn blown throughout the land. So you got to put yourself in the place of the people at the time. There's no noise pollution during this period in history. The noise of the cities, the cars, they don't exist. You're working in the fields, you're managing your crops, your livestock, going about your daily business, working, and then you hear it coming out of the hills and relaying from one hill to the next, the blast of the ram's horn blowing. And everyone knows what this means. The reserves are being called up. War is upon us, and the men would have to put up the livestock. They would pack a bag, they'd grab whatever weapon they might have, kiss their families goodbye, and head toward the pre-appointed meeting places. As they walked towards those meeting places, the sound of the horns continued to blast through the surrounding hills. They would meet up with their neighbors who are heading the same way. Groups of 2 would turn to groups of 10, then to 50, and finally the army converges together under the new king at his headquarters in Gilgal. So there's this sense of foreboding. Not for generations had the Israelites lined up for war against an enemy in this fashion. The Philistines were notorious for their brutality, and that was only expected to worsen after Jonathan's provocation on the outpost. But if they didn't fight, if the Israelites didn't fight, if they didn't win, Their farms and families would be the next target. It's worse than a do or die situation. It's a win the war, or allow your families to be slaughtered. That's the situation they're facing. Saul's spies and intelligence officers arrived at his encampment, and they let him know that indeed the Philistines have arrived in force. 3,000 chariots were there, 6,000 cavalry. So many troops they couldn't even count them. In some parts of the land, the Israelites didn't think Saul's new army could match what the Philistines were bringing to the fray. So a massive flight began to take shape. Some men packed up their homes, headed to the caves along with their wives and their children. Others crossed the Jordan River to escape the fighting. So you got this swell of refugees, displaced people. A displaced people crisis unfolding right there in the midst of all this. As the Philistine army ranks grew, the Israelites waited. The panic across the countryside grows. Saul waits on Samuel. He needs the old prophet's blessing. Samuel's still around. He's not dead yet. The old man who had ruled Israel as a judge for decades, he needs to come and he needs to pray for Saul and the Israelites. Let them know God was for them. Bless the king. Bless the fight. We need that. But as the panic and the anxiety grows in Saul's military encampment, whispers and murmuring begin. As the battle is delayed, some of the soldiers, some of the volunteers, fighters, they begin to wonder, perhaps flight was the best option. Maybe war isn't what we should be doing here. The Bible says all of Saul's troops became gripped with fear at this point. And this is where we see that pesky internal fracture in the heart of Saul that we looked at in the last episode. We see that pesky internal fracture in the heart of Saul, that undealt with weakness and insecurity, pop its head up again. Saul was competent as a general. He proved that against the Ammonites already. So the people needed more than a general here. They needed a leader. And we can imagine the host of heaven, the invisible, unseen realm, the invisible host of heaven, watching this crisis unfold and looking to Saul, and they're saying, point the people toward God. Remind them of his faithfulness. Remind them who they are, the people of God. But Saul fails right here. Reports begin to come to Saul that some of his troops have begun deserting. If he didn't do something, the king is going to have a full-blown crisis, secondary crisis, on his hand. So unwilling to wait any longer, Saul gives in to the environment of anxiety that's pervading the military camp. And rather than waiting for Samuel, that's what he was instructed to do. Rather than waiting for Samuel to offer the sacrifice to God, to give the validation of God, to let him know that God is with him, Saul goes and offers the sacrifice himself. He violates the prescription for what was supposed to happen here. And it's important to recognize what happens here. It's critical to the story of Saul. The problem wasn't that he simply offered a sacrifice. It was that he turned the sacrifice into a mere mechanical act. It wasn't about trust in God. It was about fear of the people, fear of the situation. Rather than obedience, Saul is letting the surrounding environment drive him to the next step. It wasn't real. It had no faith in it. It was a ritual, an act. And even in the Old Testament, God wasn't about mere rituals and acts. He wanted the heart. So in his first major crisis as king of Israel, King Saul failed the test. This is verses 10 to 12 in chapter 13 of 1 Samuel. It says, just as Saul was finishing with the burnt offering, Samuel arrived. Saul went out to meet him and welcome him, but Samuel said, what is this you've done? Saul replied, I saw men scattering from me, and you didn't arrive when you said you would, and the Philistines are at Michmash, ready for battle. So I said, the Philistines are ready to march against us at Gilgal, and I haven't asked for the Lord's help. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering myself before you came. He tried to cover it up with good intentions, but all King Saul had really accomplished here was advertising to the heavens his fear, his impatience, his own vulnerability to the crisis at hand. He was unwilling to compromise, or he was willing to compromise on the grounds of obedience for the sake of his own fears. And Samuel's response right here is damning. The next verse is, how foolish, Samuel exclaimed. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God gave you. Had you kept it, this is critical here, had you kept it, the Lord would have established your kingdom of Israel forever. But now your kingdom must end, for the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The Lord has already appointed him to be the leader of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. Now, setting ourselves apart from the story of this terrifying battle with the Philistines for just a minute and the wider context of the story of the days of David, this is an amazing scene. The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. You see the implications there? You hear it? That means Jesus would have come from the lineage of Saul rather than David. We would read about the Lion of the tribe of Benjamin, about Saul, the man after God's own heart. We might never have heard of David until this event, this compromise, this fatal, critical error by Saul. And the question is, that comes to my mind, did God change his mind about Saul, or was the destiny of destruction already bound up in his flawed and fractured heart, only to give birth to his demise pronounced by Samuel right here? The man, remember Samuel, the man in whom none of his prophetic words ever fell to the ground. And it would be easy to think this is an overreaction here, right? It's one mistake, it's one error. Give the guy a chance. But beyond the act, beyond the error, is the heart of the king of Saul, or the King Saul. It was flawed. It was unwilling to go through the process of repair that was needed. From the eyes of God, if this situation repeated 10 times out of 10 times, Saul would choose wrongly again and again, every time. And the consequences among leaders is always harder and higher than among others. That's one of the principles of Scripture. Leaders always have a higher burden of responsibility and face greater consequences when they fail that burden of responsibility. As Samuel departs from Saul, things begin to fall apart. Saul's army dwindled down to 600 men. Desertions increased. The refugee crisis in the surrounding regions escalated as the people heard of the delay in the fight and they feared the worst. The Philistines began to send out raiding parties, which further intensified the fear that was striking the countryside. A battalion of Philistine troops are put in place at a pass near Michmash that cut off Israel from ever being able to attack the Philistines now. So now the army has been called to Saul, and in the absence of fighting, in his paralysis, the Philistines are growing stronger. Their raiding parties are stirring up a panic. Their troop alignment is cutting off any way that the Israelites could even possibly attack them by this point. And it won't be long before the king of Israel will be rendered completely helpless, easily defeated, easy to overrun. And as this crisis grows, the focus of the story shifts. When you're reading 1 Samuel, you see like the focus, the camera moves from Saul and Gilgal. The focus of the story shifts to the hill country where Jonathan and his armor bearer are scouting the Philistine raiding party camps. This is in 1 Samuel 14. And here, once again, we see the mettle of the Prince of Israel. Rather than being driven by panic or anxiety or the press of the moment, Jonathan and his armor bearer, they're still focused on God. They sneak into the hills near a Philistine outpost. And from there, Jonathan can nearly smell the Philistines. He gets so close to them. He sees their arrogance. They think they've already won. He also sees their vulnerability. That arrogance is blinding to them. This is verses 3-7 in chapter 14. No one realized that Jonathan had left the Israelite camp. To reach the Philistine outpost, Jonathan had to go down between two rocky cliffs that were called Bozez and Seneh. The cliff of the north was in front of Michmash, and the one on the south was in front of Geba. Let's go across to the outpost of these pagans, Jonathan said to his armor-bearer. Perhaps the Lord will help us, for nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few. Do what you think best, the armor-bearer replied. I'm with you completely, whatever you decide. Two brave men right there, right? And we can find in the story that all God needed here was a heart postured in faith towards him. He didn't care about how many chariots, how many horses, how many soldiers or bronze or steel or weapons. He wasn't interested in any of that. God was looking for a heart full of faith, full of obedience. He could leverage that heart to accomplish his will here. Saul had lost sight of that, but his son didn't. And in that crisis, the faithful and focused heart of Jonathan, the Prince of Israel, becomes the pivot God could use to change the day. While Saul was growing ever more anxious and his army melted away, Jonathan, he says, perhaps, just maybe the Lord will help us. And don't forget his unnamed armor bearer. This guy, we don't even know his name, but he replies to this brazen suggestion, query. He says, do what you think is best. I'm completely with you. Sometimes a heart of honor and conviction is far more powerful in the crisis of the moment than chariots and horses. And I can't help but wonder if it was a situation like this that the future king, David, maybe he was thinking of this situation when he composed verses like these. This is in Psalms 20. He says, now I know that the Lord rescues his anointed king. He will answer him from his holy heaven and rescue him by his great power. Some nations boast of their chariots and horses, but we boast in the name of the Lord our God. Those nations will fall down and collapse, but we will rise up and stand firm. And Jonathan and his armor bearer climbed a cliff and came upon this troop of Philistines and killed 20 of them. And in that moment right there, the war was on. That's where it started. And it wasn't the war the Philistines thought they came to fight. The Philistines they owned better technology, better weapons. And although they held the advantage of numbers and strategic positions, when Jonathan and his armor bearer climbed up that cliff and met this troop on top of the peak, well, the Philistines saw 2 Israelites coming out of the earth and unleashing holy hell on them. Jonathan and the armor bearer fought with a vengeance, and word spread, probably because of how Jonathan and the armor bearer fought, how they came up on the peak. Word spread that the Israelites weren't hiding in caves, but they're setting traps for the Israelites within those caves. So suddenly, the Philistines feared that they had actually fallen into a trap. Verses 15 to 23 of chapter 14 of 1 Samuel. Terror spread through the Philistine camp and the open fields to all the troops. Even the garrison and the raiding parties were terrified. The earth shook. The terror spread from God. When Saul's watchmen in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, they saw the panicking troops scattering in every direction. So Saul said to the troops with him, call the roll and determine who has left us. They called the roll and saw that Jonathan and his armor bearer were gone. Saul told Ahijah, bring the ark of God, for it was with the Israelites at that time. While Saul spoke to the priest, the panic in the Philistines' camp increased in intensity. So Saul said to the priest, stop what you're doing. Saul and all his troops with him assembled and marched to the battle. And there the Philistines were fighting against each other in great confusion. There were Hebrews from the area who had gone out earlier into the camp to join the Philistines, but even they joined the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelite men who had been hiding in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were fleeing, they also joined Saul and Jonathan in the battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and Israel wins the battle that day. And for the rest of Saul's reign, the Philistines didn't pose that level of arrogance and presumptuousness against Israel ever again. Like I said, the fighting wasn't completed by Saul. David would break the Philistine back. That's all to come. But Saul's, especially through his son Jonathan, became more and more victorious against this occupying army. Suddenly the Israelites had hope. They had hope of finally being freed from the threat of the Philistines. But even as his victories increased against the enemies of Israel, we still find Saul consistently making errors. In chapter 14, we find him making a rash oath. We find him making stupid decisions, such as not letting the soldiers eat. We see him changing his mind, not based upon his vow or even what God has instructed, but based upon, again, a fear of the people. Saul was an effective military leader. God was with him, but many of the mistakes, many of the errors that he makes in this time period are in direct contrast to decisions and standards of faithfulness that leaders during the era of the judges that they also did. Now, we're not going to go further into that today, but we do need to touch on one final story under the reign of Saul. This is the story found in chapter 15 of 1 Samuel, and it's the story of that terrible day when his frailty of heart, Saul's heart, his weakness of conviction, it all finally catches up with him. This is the day Saul lost the favor and the grace of God, finally and completely on his reign. The plan was simple enough. The Bible tells us God is a jealous God. He keeps track of those who do him wrong and who do his people wrong. Well, way back in the era of wandering in the wilderness, the Amalekites took advantage of Israel. And now God decides it's payback time. So he sends Samuel to Saul with specific instructions. He says, wipe them out. Not a man, not a woman, not a child among these Amalekites left behind. This is to be an eradication. We'd call it a genocide today, what happens right here. All right. And the Bible is unapologetic about it. That's exactly what's unfolding. God wants them all dead. Even their livestock is supposed to be wiped out. No trace of them left behind. So this is Saul's chance to prove he can follow instructions. The last time we saw Samuel with Saul was when Saul failed to follow the instructions given him. And Samuel said his kingdom would not last forever as a result. Well, what's going to happen this time? Saul summons the army, and they go to war against the Amalekites. He strikes them down. He chases the survivors almost all the way down to Egypt. He captures the king of the Amalekites. This king's name is Agag. The rest of the people are put to the sword, but Agag and the best of the sheep and the livestock, the plunders of war, they're preserved and they're brought before Saul at his royal court, far from where Samuel sits. He wasn't with Saul this day. He's the prophet. He's sitting miles and miles away. But God speaks to the prophet. And God says, I regret that I made Saul king, for he's turned away from following me and has not carried out my instructions. This wasn't just a weakness of heart and character on the part of Saul. He defied specific instructions. This was rebellion. God said, do it this specific way, kill them all. But Saul chose a path he liked better. The Bible says that Saul became angry, that he cried out to the Lord all night long. And when I read that passage in 1 Samuel, I really think there was a genuine mourning on the part of Samuel. I think his memory, his human nostalgia and memory reflected on those moments that he spent with this king when he was a young man, head and shoulders above all the rest of Israel. He considered how the Spirit of God came upon Saul, how it changed him. He thought of him hiding among the supplies at his coronation. He saw all the things that might have been regarding the young king who had now grown old and cold towards the command of God. And that mourning in Samuel turned to anger. So the next morning, Samuel gets up and he heads towards where he thought Saul was. But along the way, he learns that Saul moved his camp and he went to Carmel to build a monument for himself. Now, since when do Israelites build monuments for themselves? But that's what Saul's doing now. So Samuel turns that way. He trudges along, an old man now. He's decades removed from the little boy who first heard the command of God in the tabernacle. And he didn't know what he was hearing then. He knows now. His long gray hair and beard dreaded up, stacked atop each other. A razor's never touched his head. That was his mom's vow, remember. He's the picture, Samuel is. He's the picture of faithfulness before God, going to confront the king who sold it all away so cheaply. And Samuel arrives. He trudges up the hill where Saul has set up this monument for himself. And as he approaches the king, he hears Saul's fake tone of flattery and dishonest loyalty. This is chapter 15, verse 13. It says, when Samuel came to him, Saul said, may the Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. Now, I'm not sure why Saul greeted him like that. He knew he hadn't followed the Lord's instructions. They were deliberate, explicit. Was he planning on pretending like he misunderstood? Well, Samuel's having none of it. If you followed the Lord's instructions, then why do I hear the bleating of sheep and cattle? That's the troops. They brought them back from the Amalekites, the best of the sheep and cattle. They wanted to use them as sacrifices to God, but never fear, we killed the rest of them as instructed. Stop it, Samuel replied. Knock off the charade. Let me tell you what the Lord told me last night. And this is like that dialogue there, that's nearly word for word from the pages of 1 Samuel. Tell me, Saul replies, as if he's eager to hear what God is saying to the prophet. Now, this is word for word from 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 17 to 23. Samuel continued, although you once considered yourself unimportant, have you not become the leader of the tribes of Israel? The Lord appointed you king over Israel and then sent you on a mission and said, go and completely destroy the sinful Amalekites. Fight against them until you have annihilated them. So why didn't you obey the Lord? Why did you rush on the plunder and do what was evil in the Lord's sight? But I did obey the Lord, Saul answered. I went on the mission the Lord gave me. I brought back Agag, king of Amalek, and I completely destroyed the Amalekites. The troops took sheep, cattle, and the plunder, the best of what was set apart for destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. Then Samuel said, does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? Look, to obey is better than sacrifice. To pay attention is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and defiance like wickedness and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. I guess it's right about here where the gravity of the moment hits Saul. He realizes he's gone too far. God isn't talking to him about weakness of character. God is seeing him as a rebel, an enemy of God. So he goes, I've sinned. I've messed up. I was afraid of the people. Forgive me. Pray to God for forgiveness with me. I think it's interesting. Now it's to God. While ago it was your God. It's like he already felt a distance between him and God. Samuel replies, it's too late. Saul doesn't realize until maybe right about here that the jig is up. He's gone too far, and God's judgment has already been written in the heavens. I won't go with you, Samuel replies. You rejected the word of God, and now God is rejecting you. These aren't just words that Samuel is pronouncing over Saul. This is judgment. Something's shifting in the heavenly realm all around Saul as these words come out of Samuel's mouth. In the spirit realm, the light is swirling away and the darkness begins to envelop Saul. After this moment, whenever we see Saul, we'll find him in the borderlines of madness and instability. The God who changed him to make him worthy of being king is now withdrawing his hand so that the weight of authority and trust God put upon the man crushes him. Chapter 15, verses 27 to 29. When Samuel turned to go, Saul grabbed the hem of his robe, and it tore. Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingship of Israel away from you today and has given it to your neighbor who's better than you. Furthermore, the Eternal One of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man who changes his mind. When I read those words, I hear the sound of this cold and creepy wind blowing up that hillside where they're speaking. The celebration and pomp that Saul and his most loyal men had been enjoying up to this point, it's now being whisked away into an ominous dread. And Samuel's just about done. But before he departs, he calls to some of the officers standing there, probably open-mouthed, just standing there quiet, not knowing what to do. He says, bring me Agag. He hasn't seen the king yet, the king of the Amalekites. The old prophet just knows that Saul didn't fulfill the instructions of God. Agag is escorted before Samuel. This king of the Amalekites thought his life had been spared, but now, as he's escorted before the old man who he's heard of but never actually seen, he probably began to tremble again. And Samuel, the last judge of Israel, looks upon this pagan king, and he says, as your sword has made women childless, so your mother will be childless among women. Then Samuel, this old prophet, big long dreads in his beard and his hair, he takes up this sword and he hacks at Agag. Not once, not twice, but over and over and over again. A brutal, violent, slow death to the pagan king. And the Bible says Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord. And when he's finished, his hands, his robes splattered with blood, he looks to Saul, who stood by trembling. He's feeling the effects of the change that's coming on him, even in that moment, as the nature of his life is transformed and transitioned from the chosen of God to the rejected of God. And Samuel probably took one last look into the eyes, into the face of the king who so much hope and promise had once rested upon. Then he dropped the bloody sword onto the mutilated carcass of Agag lying butchered at the feet of Saul. Then Samuel turns and he walks away, taking with him the presence of God from Saul's life. Now, Samuel would never see Saul again for the rest of his life. For those who know the story, you might recognize there's a little bit of a qualifier on that statement. We'll get to it. But Saul, he would never again see the presence of God. And though decades were still left in Saul's reign, they were decades of darkness. They were decades clouded with a manic, bipolar depression, a cloud of darkness that would consume him and ruin his life. And in that darkness, Saul would not merely bring Israel to the brink of destruction, but even his own family. The only people who survived Saul among his family members were those who would never recover from the traumatic events that he inflicted upon them in the remaining years of his life. Betrayal, abuse, death. The house of Saul was now in a state of collapse for the rest of his life.